The dawn broke cold and indifferent over the vast expanse of the Naliboki Forest, a sprawling wilderness of dense pines, tangled undergrowth, marshes that swallowed tracks whole, and silent glades where mist clung stubbornly to the earth like a second skin. It was mid-1941, and the German invasion of the East had transformed the region into a crucible of terror. Villages burned in hours, roads clogged with fleeing families, the countryside patrolled by German units, Lithuanian collaborators, and roaming Einsatzgruppen detachments, searching relentlessly for Jews. Against this backdrop of sudden annihilation, the forest, ancient, indifferent, and sprawling beyond the horizon, became the only sanctuary left for those who wanted to live. People moved through the trees in small, terrified groups, many with nothing but the clothes on their backs, the sound of gunfire still echoing in their ears, and the grim understanding that the world they once knew no longer existed. The forest swallowed them quickly, its shadows hiding their movement, its blanket of pine needles muffling their footsteps, its dense canopies shielding them from German aircraft. But the forest alone could not protect them. Protection required organization, structure, and a will to survive stronger than the terror pressing against them from all sides. In those early months, before fortifications, before shelters, before patrol routes were established, the first fugitives entering the woods confronted a raw and unforgiving reality. The forest was both refuge and executioner, a place where one could hide, but also where one could freeze, starve, be hunted, or vanish without a trace. There was no food distribution, no shelter from storms, no safe water, no tools, no clothing. Fires had to be extinguished at the faintest hint of aircraft engines, and smoke had to be hidden beneath layers of wet leaves to avoid detection. Every snapped twig felt like a gunshot. Every distant voice felt like the approach of death. The fugitives' first nights in the forest were a brutal initiation into the kind of existence that would define the next 3 years. Nights spent shivering, huddled under makeshift coverings of brush, wondering if dawn would reveal German patrols sweeping through the trees. And yet, despite the overwhelming dangers, more and more people fled into the wilderness, for the cities, towns, and roads had become death traps in which German authority reigned supreme. Word began to spread that survival meant vanishing into the landscape. The Naliboki Forest, stretching across what is now Belarus, became a magnet for the desperate. Soon, lone fugitives merged into groups, groups into clusters, and clusters into something resembling a community of the hunted. But there was no leadership yet, no strategy, no plan for how hundreds, eventually more than 1,000, could survive the brutal winters, the German manhunts, and the near-constant scarcity. The forest itself seemed to watch, waiting to see whether these people would succumb to its challenges or carve out something unprecedented from the darkness. As the number of refugees swelled, they began probing deeper into the forest's interior, following animal trails, wading through bogs, and choosing their havens with growing care. They learned that Germans rarely ventured into the deeper thickets, where the terrain became treacherous and unnavigable. They learned how to detect the sound of incoming patrols from the unnatural silence that preceded them. They learned how to gather edible roots, berries, and nuts when available, though these meager offerings could never sustain so many. They learned quickly that the forest could not be outweighed. They would have to build something inside it, something that could endure. And so, in small clearing after small clearing, fires began to spark cautiously to life. People dug shallow trenches into the earth, reinforced them with logs, and covered them with branches to create crude shelters where dozens could sleep in relative warmth. The first structures were temporary, little more than survival bowls carved into the soil, but they represented a pivotal shift. No longer were these refugees merely hiding. They were beginning to establish themselves, beginning to occupy the forest consciously rather than simply fading into it. No one fully understood yet that these rudimentary shelters were the first roots of something far larger, something that would grow into the largest Jewish partisan encampment of World War II. But even at this early stage, survival demanded order. Scavenging parties ventured out daily, searching for abandoned farms, hidden cellars, or unharvested fields where remnants of grain or livestock might still be found. Others gathered materials for building: fallen logs, bundles of grass for insulation, strips of bark for ropes, stones for fire rings. Makeshift workshops formed in shallow pits where metal scraps were hammered into tools. Food, even in the best of times, was scarce. Many days, people survived on broth made from boiling pine needles or on the thin porridge created from ground-up tree bark. Water had to be collected from streams far from populated paths. A single misplaced footprint in the mud could draw German attention. But despite the fear, despite the hunger, despite the oppressive uncertainty, the population in the forest grew rapidly as word spread that there were people, armed people, organizing resistance and constructing what the Germans would soon call a forest Jerusalem. The first defensive measures emerged just as organically as the shelters. Lookouts were posted in high trees or on small rises in the terrain. Paths were swept with branches behind traveling groups to erase footprints. Natural choke points in the forest were identified, narrow paths where, if necessary, trees could be felled to block German vehicles. Early weapons were few. A handful of rifles stolen or scavenged from battlefields, a few pistols hidden before the occupation began, and improvised knives. The forest might protect them from immediate execution, but without armed defense, they would not survive the first German sweep. The people understood this instinctively. Their refuge needed more than hiding places. It needed to become a fortress built of trees, quiet observation, and relentless vigilance. As days turned to weeks, patterns emerged. Patrols were scheduled. Work details were assigned. Night watches were established. Entire families contributed. Older children gathered pine branches for bedding. Elders mended clothing. The stronger adults cut wood or dug pits. This emerging order did not come from a single directive, but from the collective understanding that organized survival was the only survival. And yet, something was missing, something invisible but essential: the cohesive force needed to transform desperate fugitives into a functioning community capable not only of surviving, but of resisting. That transformation began with the arrival of a small but determined group of armed men, whose decision to defend themselves instead of fleeing ignited a chain of events that would reshape the entire forest. They entered the camp with hunted, wary eyes, bringing weapons, a fierce determination, and a vision that the forest could become more than a hiding place. Their presence electrified the growing community. Suddenly, survival did not depend solely on fear or flight, but on defense, retaliation, and structured resistance. With the arrival of this group, everything in the forest began to shift: the organizational structure, the ambitions, the level of discipline, the sense of possibility. The fugitives, once scattered and terrified, began to gather around a central idea: that the forest could be transformed into a sanctuary, not just for dozens, but for hundreds, and eventually over 1,200 people. A hidden city, defended by partisan arms, fed by daring raids, governed by rules forged from necessity, and fueled by the unbreakable instinct to live. The Naliboki Forest, vast and ancient, had become more than a backdrop. It had become the stage upon which one of the most extraordinary survival operations of the Second World War would unfold. A forest that would soon echo with the sounds of carpenters building bunkers, scouts moving silently in the night, blacksmiths shaping stolen metal, sentries calling warnings, and eventually gunfire aimed not at civilians fleeing death, but at the German forces determined to hunt them. The sanctuary had begun, but survival would demand far more. The early forest gatherings, Once scattered clusters of fugitives, driven by instinct and desperation, soon began evolving into a structured settlement as necessity pushed them to reorganize for long-term survival. The Naliboki Forest was immense, but its terrain was unforgiving. Marshy lowlands that could swallow a person, dense thickets where visibility collapsed into darkness, narrow clearings hemmed by towering pines, and frigid streams cutting unpredictable paths through mud and root. To transform such chaos into a refuge for hundreds required far more than the simple acts of hiding or improvisation. It demanded the deliberate construction of an encampment capable of sustaining life under constant threat of discovery. The people understood that they could not wander endlessly from one thicket to the next, nor could they remain dispersed in small, vulnerable pockets across the forest. What was needed was a central camp, concealed, defensible, organized, where the fugitives could regroup, share resources, and prepare for the grueling months ahead. The forest itself dictated the first architectural principles, with its natural contours guiding where structures could be safely built, how smoke could be concealed, where water could be accessed without leaving trails, and how the population could blend with the wilderness so completely that German search parties would never suspect hundreds were living just beyond sight. They chose a site deep within the forest's heart, an area ringed by natural obstacles, a marsh on one side, a dense section of impassable birch on another, fallen logs forming natural barriers to the north, and a shallow rise providing a lookout point to the south. The ground here was firm enough to support construction, yet the canopy was dense enough to conceal the camp from above, even if German aircraft flew low searching for signs of life. The first structures erected were simple earth bunkers, partially dug into the ground and reinforced with logs cut from fallen trees. These bunkers, called samlankas, were deliberately designed to trap heat in winter and remain cool during summer. They were built by digging shallow pits, lining the walls with interlocked logs, roofing them with additional logs, and finally covering the structure with layers of earth, grass, and pine needles, so that from a distance they appeared indistinguishable from the forest floor. Smoke chimneys were crafted with bends and narrow openings to diffuse heat signatures and prevent visible smoke columns. The placement of these bunkers followed an emerging pattern, spaced enough to reduce fire hazards, tightly enough to protect against encirclement, always angled to minimize lines of sight from surrounding clearings. As more fugitives entered the forest seeking shelter, construction accelerated. New crews formed organically as people with stronger arms, better tools, or building knowledge took the lead. Dirt piles were spread evenly across the forest floor to avoid creating suspicious mounds. Water from nearby streams was used to pack mud tightly between logs, sealing gaps against cold and wind. Even the debris from construction was carefully concealed. Branches burned at night under controlled fires, scrap wood buried or reused, footprints brushed away meticulously by sweeps of pine boughs. The camp was not meant to be temporary. It was intended to disappear into the environment completely. By the time dozens of zamlankas had been constructed, the settlement resembled not a village, but an extension of the forest itself. But shelters alone could not sustain the growing population. Survival demanded the establishment of internal systems for food, sanitation, defense, patrol, work distribution, communication, medicine, and order. In the absence of formal leadership, routines formed from necessity. A central clearing, kept small enough to remain hidden, became the hub of daily activity. Here, scouts returned with reports. Builders gathered materials. Women and older refugees prepared meals using whatever could be scavenged or procured. Water carriers hauled buckets from distant streams, always ensuring they stepped on stones or roots to avoid leaving footprints in the mud. Cookfires were placed in underground pits called smoke holes, designed to burn with little flame and no visible smoke. For the first time in weeks, the fugitives tasted warm food again. Thin soups, boiled roots,
sometimes grains captured from abandoned farms, occasionally dried mushrooms or berries. Food remained a relentless challenge. The forest offered limited nourishment for hundreds, let alone a rapidly growing community. The early days relied heavily on foraging, but as more people arrived, foraging alone could not sustain them. Thus, expeditions formed to venture toward the forest edges under cover of night, seeking food from nearby farms, unguarded storage sheds, or fields where leftover grain might still be found. These expeditions required stealth, planning, and coordination. They also required guards to watch for patrols. German forces commonly shot anyone found outside ghettos or villages without permits, and collaborators sometimes accompanied them. These risks made every food mission an exercise in controlled terror, yet without them, the settlement could not survive. In response to these dangers, the developing camp began creating its first defensive mechanisms. Lookout points were assigned on high ground or atop tall trees. Scouts learned to identify the distant sounds of German boots, the rumble of trucks, or the crack of branches under heavy loads. The forest had its own language, and understanding that language could mean the difference between life and death. Warning signals were devised, a whistle imitating a forest bird, a tapping rhythm on tree trunks, a string of stones tied to branches to rustle in specific patterns if tripped. These signals allowed the camp to vanish in seconds, fire smothered, tools hidden, people diving into bunkers or dispersing into the trees. Paths through the camp were not straight. They wound unpredictably, designed to confuse outsiders and avoid visible trails. Some paths led nowhere deliberately, ending abruptly in thick underbrush to mislead intruders. Others were disguised with leaves and branches, visible only to those who knew the markers: an odd-shaped rock, a scar on a tree, a tuft of moss bent in an unnatural direction. The forest became both home and labyrinth. At night, the sounds of construction, whispers, and the crackling of hidden fires blended with the forest's natural chorus of owls and insects. By day, silence ruled. As the camp grew, so did its infrastructure. Workshops were dug into the forest floor, where metal could be hammered into knives, tools, or repair pieces. Tailoring pits emerged, where torn clothing was patched or repurposed. A primitive medical corner formed around a shallow shelter, where herbs were dried and where makeshift bandages were cleaned. People with knowledge of herbs became invaluable, gathering medicinal plants, nettle, juniper, wild garlic, to treat infections, coughs, or wounds from working the land. A quarantine area was marked off to isolate sickness before it spread. Even a distribution schedule developed, with work crews rotating tasks: firewood gathering, water retrieval, food preparation, shelter reinforcement, perimeter watch, construction work. Order reduced chaos, and chaos was a threat that could kill as surely as hunger or patrols. The camp's population grew unevenly. Some days groups of 10 or 20 fugitives arrived with only panic in their eyes. Other days a single person wandered into the clearing, barefoot, frostbitten, barely able to speak. Each newcomer brought stories of fresh German sweeps, burning villages, destroyed ghettos, or massacres. These stories hardened the camp's resolve and reinforced the realization that the forest was no longer a refuge of last resort. It was the only remaining place of life for Jews in the region. With population growth came new challenges. Noise discipline became increasingly important. Children were taught not to cry loudly. Their play was redirected toward quiet tasks like stacking pine cones or helping sort small tools. Waste disposal pits were dug far from living areas, and strict sanitation rules were enforced to avoid illness. Supplies were pooled. Individual ownership of food or tools was discouraged. Disputes were mediated by informal councils to prevent fractures within the community. The forest demanded unity. And with unity came the understanding that the camp could not remain neutral. The forest was filling not only with fugitives, but with threats: German patrols, collaborationist police, local bandits, and other partisan groups with their own agendas. The fugitives realized that no amount of hiding would preserve them. They needed armed defenders, not to wage war on the scale of armies, but to ensure no German or collaborator force could enter the camp unchallenged. Thus began the earliest formations of a partisan fighting group. Armed men began training others in basic weapon handling, stealth movement, and the use of terrain for ambush positions. Patrol routes extended outward from the camp like a protective web. The forest, once a passive shelter, began to transform into a territory defended with intention. By the time the settlement reached its early size, well over 100 people, the transformation was unmistakable. What had begun as fragments of terror fleeing into the trees was becoming an organized refuge with living quarters, workshops, patrol lines, and a growing defensive perimeter. And as the population continued
to expand, the camp's identity evolved as well. It was no longer merely a group of fugitives hiding from death. It was a settlement preparing to endure, to resist, and to protect all who sought shelter within its boundaries. The forest was no longer just a hiding place. It was becoming a community, one that could not remain passive for long. Because as more people arrived, bringing news of approaching German actions, the reality became clear. Survival required more than building, more than hiding, more than organization. Survival required resistance.
The forest had offered shelter, but it would not offer peace. As the encampment grew in size and capability, the inevitability of confrontation pressed against the tree line like a gathering storm. Early on, the fugitives understood that the Germans would not ignore the vast stretches of woodland forever. The occupiers knew that forests across Belarus and the surrounding regions had become havens for resistance, deserters, escaped POWs, and Jews fleeing extermination. Patrols increased as the months passed. First came small reconnaissance teams probing into the edges of the woods, then mounted units accompanied by dogs following faint trails, then motorized detachments sent to test whether these stretches of wilderness housed anything more than wildlife. For the camp now forming deep within Naliboki Forest, these early incursions represented a moment of truth. Would their hastily constructed shelters and fragile organization survive the first encounter with trained soldiers equipped with rifles, grenades, maps, and dogs? The first contact came not through a direct attack, but through sound. Footsteps in the distance, snapped branches, quiet voices speaking German. A lookout positioned in a high cone, scanning the perimeter with practiced patience, spotted movement in the dim undergrowth. Helmet shapes bobbing between tree trunks, the faint glint of metal, the distinct outlines of rifles carried in ready position. The warning was given instantly through a coded bird call, a sound that cut through the forest like a signal flare without revealing its human origin. Within the camp, everything shifted at once. Fires were smothered, pits sealed, tools dropped silently into depressions in the earth. Children were ushered into shelters. Adults flattened themselves in ditches and behind logs, each person instinctively selecting a hiding place rehearsed again and again in drills. The forest held its breath. The German patrol moved slowly, their boots pressing deep into the carpet of pine needles. The fugitives could make out their conversations through the trees, not urgent, not alarmed, but probing, curious, expectant. They were searching for signs of unauthorized activity. The smell of smoke, discarded clothing, footprints were the faint outline of a bunker roof. The patrol passed within meters of where dozens of people lay hidden, their faces pressed into dirt, their hands gripped tightly around improvised defensive weapons. Every heartbeat in the camp seemed to thrum through the soil. When the patrol withdrew, the camp exhaled, but not in relief. This encounter had confirmed what everyone already suspected. The forest was under watch, and discovery was a matter of time. There would not always be luck. There would not always be a slow probing patrol. Sometimes force would come fast and with purpose. This realization accelerated the formation of a defensive cadre that would soon become the backbone of the camp's resistance operations. Scouts were assigned permanent roles and trained to move silently across the forest floor, their steps placed on roots,
rocks, and patches of moss to avoid disturbing soil or leaves. These scouts developed an intimate knowledge of the forest's natural rhythms, where birds nested, how wind moved through the branches, what animals made which noises, and, most importantly, how to detect the subtle intrusions that signaled an approaching threat. The first true skirmish erupted weeks later when a German collaborationist police detachment ventured deeper than any patrol had before. They were hunting what they believed to be a group of escaped Jews hiding in the forest, and unlike earlier patrols, they came prepared to kill. They followed a faint trail left by a poorly concealed foraging party, and within hours they were approaching the camp's outer perimeter. The scouts detected them far sooner than the intruders realized, and the warning rushed back through the camp's network. But this time, instead of simply hiding, the defenders prepared to fight. A defensive line formed along a natural choke point, where a narrow passage between two ridges forced attackers to funnel into single file. Fallen logs were quickly arranged into low barricades. Men armed with the handful of rifles available took prone positions, while others armed with improvised weapons lay in ambush behind brush. The tension in those moments was suffocating. The fugitives were not soldiers, but the primal instinct to defend one's people transcended training. The enemy reached the choke point cautiously at first, unaware of the trap. They advanced with their rifles raised, scanning the undergrowth, kicking at leaves, pausing periodically to listen. Then one of the defenders shifted slightly, a motion perhaps imperceptible to most, but enough to alert one of the intruders, who raised his weapon and fired a shot into the trees. The forest exploded into action. Rifle shots cracked through the air, bark splintered from trees. The defenders returned fire with every ounce of desperation and fury pent up from months of terror. The sound of gunfire echoed across the forest, sending birds scattering into the sky. The logs and bush piles became defensive redoubts. Several attackers fell in the first exchange, struck by shots fired from hidden positions. Others scrambled for cover, confused by the sudden eruption of resistance. They had expected a few unarmed fugitives. What they encountered instead was an organized defensive network. The skirmish lasted only minutes, but its impact was profound. The attackers retreated under fire, dragging their wounded, leaving behind weapons, ammunition, and equipment. The forest swallowed them as they withdrew, their shouts fading into the undergrowth. When silence returned, the defenders stood facing one another in shock, adrenaline coursing through them. The fight had proven something essential. The camp could defend itself. The forest was not simply a hiding place, it could be a fortress. The captured weapons transformed the defenders immediately. Rifles, pistols, ammunition belts, even a pair of grenades. These were treasures beyond value. Every weapon meant one more defender who could stand against German patrols. Every bullet meant one more chance at survival. The camp leadership organized the newly obtained weapons with the precision of a military unit. Rifles were cleaned, ammunition distributed carefully, and the next defensive drills were updated based on the lessons learned during the skirmish. From that day forward, the camp's posture shifted from purely defensive to cautiously assertive. Scouts began mapping the surrounding forest not just for escape routes, but for potential ambush sites, dead zones, and natural defensive barriers. They marked areas where streams formed natural moats, where dense thickets could hide movement, where high ridges offered clear vantage points, and where marshes could trap advancing troops. Knowledge of terrain became as important as weapons themselves. The forest had become a strategic asset. But the defenders understood something else. The skirmish would not be unanswered. The Germans did not tolerate resistance. That small police unit would report what they had encountered, and soon larger forces would come. The question was not if, but when. This urgency drove the camp to accelerate its defensive engineering, digging deeper bunkers, creating underground escape tunnels, reinforcing bunker roofs with additional log layers, camouflaging entry points with deceptive patterns, and enlarging the network of lookouts to cover more territory. Silent communication signals were refined.
Run routes were tested repeatedly. Entire sections of the forest were mapped down to each fallen log and boulder. Children memorized escape paths. Adults memorized emergency roles. The next confrontation came in the late autumn when the leaves fell and the forest became more exposed. A larger German force, this time accompanied by dogs and armed with submachine guns, attempted to penetrate the forest interior. Their approach was detected early by scouts, who spotted them moving in coordinated formation, sweeping the forest systematically. The defenders understood that direct confrontation against such a force would be suicidal. Instead, they relied on deception and the terrain itself. Scouts used hit-and-run tactics, firing a shot from a distant flank to redirect their attention, then melting into the forest. Fallen logs were toppled to block narrow paths. Marshy ground was deliberately used to slow the enemy's advance. At one point, the defenders rigged a deadfall trap with a weighted log that crashed down when the Germans triggered a concealed trip branch, causing chaos and halting their advance. The skirmish unfolded not as a traditional battle, but as a series of guerrilla maneuvers: ambush, retreat, misdirection, disappearance. The German forces eventually withdrew, frustrated and unnerved by an enemy they could not see, could not track, or could not pin down. This engagement cemented a new doctrine: mobility, not static defense, would preserve the camp. The forest was too vast, too complex, too unpredictable for the Germans to master, but the inhabitants who now lived within it were learning to master it intimately. A strategy evolved. If Germans came too close to the camp, the inhabitants would scatter through prearranged escape routes, regrouping hours later at secondary positions. The camp itself, though vital, became less important than the people who inhabited it. Structures could be rebuilt, shelters could be replaced, but lives could not. In the winter that followed, the defenders strengthened their patrol network, training new scouts, training fighters in silent movement, and expanding their knowledge of terrain. Winter brought new dangers. Tracks left in the snow could betray their location, and the crackling of frozen branches could reveal movement. Yet winter also brought advantages. The Germans were less willing to conduct deep forest sweeps in freezing temperatures, and the camp used this time to strengthen its internal organization. By the time spring arrived, the camp was no longer a passive refuge, but a functioning defensive enclave with its own scouting corps, security perimeter, and armed defenders who had already survived multiple engagements. Skirmishes, though small in scale compared to battles elsewhere in Europe, carried immense weight here. Each one determined whether hundreds of civilians would live or die. The forest had tested its inhabitants, and they had endured. More importantly, they had begun to understand that survival did not depend solely on hiding or luck. Survival required resistance, vigilance, adaptation, and the ruthless understanding that the enemy would return again and again, until the forest itself became a battlefield. The defenders had proven themselves capable of fighting back, but the battles ahead would be far larger, far deadlier, and far more complex. The Germans were beginning to understand that somewhere in the Naliboki Forest, a growing community of Jews was not only hiding, but resisting. And resistance in German-occupied territory demanded annihilation. The forest was no longer simply a refuge. It was becoming a front line.
The forest settlement that had begun as a scattered refuge was now evolving into something far more formidable, a fortress carved out of wilderness, a hidden stronghold defined not by walls or towers, but by discipline, planning, and the relentless understanding that the next German incursion would not be a probing patrol or a confused skirmish. It would be a coordinated attempt to annihilate them. The defenders knew the enemy was learning. They knew that reports of large groups of Jewish fugitives in Naliboki Forest were moving up the German command chain. They knew that local collaborators were spreading rumors of armed camps. And they knew that the German doctrine for such resistance was brutal and unwavering: encircle, destroy, burn the forest, and hunt down survivors. With these pressures closing in, the camp transitioned from improvised survival to systematic military readiness. They mapped every ridge, ravine, stream, clearing, and thicket within miles. Patrols were no longer occasional measures, but constant operations rotating in shifts day and night. Scouts developed code signals using bird calls, tapping patterns, and subtle twig arrangements. A listening network expanded outward in layers. The first layer detecting movement on forest edges, the second monitoring paths and stream crossings, the third stationed at hidden vantage points where binocular-equipped lookouts could see hundreds of meters between trees. The settlement itself became a maze of deception. Dummy shelters were built in vulnerable positions to mislead intruders. Paths were deliberately confusing, winding into dead ends unless travelers knew the hidden markers. Food supplies were stored in multiple caches so that a single breach would not destroy the camp's reserves. Escape routes branched outward in every direction like arteries. From above, the camp was invisible. From the ground, it was a puzzle that exposed outsiders before they ever reached its heart. Armed units grew steadily. Every rifle obtained in earlier skirmishes was maintained obsessively. Every bullet counted. The defenders learned to fight not as scattered fugitives, but as a coherent guerrilla force relying on terrain, ambush, and speed. Training drills became daily rituals. Recruits were taught to move silently, to fire only when necessary, to strike from concealment and relocate instantly. They learned the art of melting into the landscape, stepping into shadow, blending with bark, positioning themselves behind fallen logs or in depressions created by uprooted trees. The forest became their camouflage. Fighters practiced coordinated ambushes, a forward unit firing 2 or 3 shots, then falling back to secondary positions while flank units delivered crossfire from unexpected angles. In dense forest, visibility was limited. A few seconds of surprise could decide everything. They trained for these seconds relentlessly. Food shortages forced the camp to expand its operational radius. Foraging was no longer sufficient. Raiding nearby farms became a tactical necessity. But these raids were not random acts. They were coordinated missions executed with military precision. Scouts would first observe farms for days, noting guard routines, livestock locations, kitchen schedules, and the movements of any collaborators. Raiding teams would then approach silently from the forest, strike quickly to seize grain, potatoes, flour, or livestock, and disappear into the woods before Germans could respond. The success of these operations not only kept the camp alive, but also strengthened the fighters' confidence and sharpened their tactics. The forest began to operate like a living organism, absorbing sustenance, responding to threats, and growing stronger with each engagement. But the Germans were escalating as well. Their patrols became larger, better armed, often accompanied by dogs trained to track human scent. Some patrols left behind markers on trees to guide future incursions deeper into the forest. Others set traps along paths. Thin wires stretched low between branches, pressure-triggered flares, and concealed pits meant to break legs or slow retreat. The forest itself became contested ground. Scouting became dangerous. Patrolling became a form of combat. The first major battle came when a substantial German force, bolstered by local collaborators and supported by light armored vehicles, pushed deep into the forest in a deliberate attempt to locate and destroy the camp. They entered with methodical precision, spacing themselves at intervals, deploying dogs at the point, and using axes to clear narrow paths as they advanced. Their strategy centered on encirclement, compressing the forest area inwards like a tightening noose to trap whatever resistance lay inside. The defenders detected the movement early through their layered lookout system. Runners alerted the camp. Within minutes, the entire settlement shifted into battle mode. Fires were extinguished, tools hidden, non-combatants ushered into deep forest pockets along designated escape routes.
The defenders formed strike teams along both flanks of the advancing Germans, not to meet them head-on, but to fracture their formation before it could close. The opening exchange came from a ridge where defenders had positioned themselves behind fallen logs. They fired a controlled volley, not enough to reveal their numbers, but enough to force the Germans to halt and reorient. Immediately after firing, the defenders relocated downslope to avoid return fire. The Germans responded with aggressive force, spraying bullets into the trees, advancing cautiously, then speeding up when their dogs cut scent. But the forest betrayed them. The terrain was uneven, tangled, deceptive. Dogs lost trails, mud slowed movement, visibility collapsed into a maze of branches. The defenders used this to their advantage, striking from one side, vanishing, then reappearing on the opposite flank. The Germans attempted to regroup, shouting commands that echoed off the trees, creating phantom directions. Their officers urged them inward, urging them to maintain momentum. But the defenders had set the battlefield carefully. Marshy ground ahead had been chosen for its ability to swallow boots and impede movement. When the Germans entered it, their line slowed and compressed, and it was here that the defenders executed the battle's decisive ambush. Hidden in elevated positions overlooking the marsh, they opened sustained fire that sowed chaos among the attackers. Unable to maneuver, slipping in mud, some Germans dropped, while others hurled themselves towards the sides to escape the crossfire. The defenders held their fire selectively, targeting officers and dog handlers first. Without dogs and commands, the German force dissolved into smaller disoriented clusters. Then came the second phase. The defenders withdrew deeper into the forest, drawing the surviving Germans into a dense thicket, where the ground was riddled with concealed pits and where fallen trees blocked easy movement. Here, the defenders struck again, but only briefly, then vanished once more. Their goal was not annihilation, it was survival through disruption. They intended to break the attack's momentum, force the Germans to retreat, and teach them that the forest itself was hostile. By late afternoon, the German force, battered, confused, low on ammunition, and unable to locate the main camp, began to withdraw. The defenders shadowed them silently, ensuring the retreat was genuine. When the forest finally fell quiet, the defenders regrouped, counted their ammunition, and tended their wounded, remarkably few thanks to the terrain's protection. They had survived the largest encirclement attempt yet. The aftermath marked a turning point. The Germans now recognized that the forest harbored not scattered fugitives, but a highly organized fighting presence. Retreating units undoubtedly carried reports describing coordinated ambushes, deceptive maneuvering, and an enemy that seemed to move like shadows. This victory also solidified internal doctrine. The camp would operate as a mobile defense network, never standing still long enough to be trapped, never allowing the enemy to dictate the terms of engagement. But victory brought new challenges. The Germans, humiliated by the failed sweep, would return with greater force. The collaborators who joined them would report new details. Rumors of a Jewish partisan fortress began circulating in nearby towns, prompting fear, defiance, and retaliation. The forest settlement now needed not only defensive strategies, but offensive capabilities. The ability to strike first, disrupt German plans, eliminate collaborators, gather resources, and preempt future attacks. Thus, in the weeks that followed, the camp began shifting from a defensive refuge to an active partisan center, capable of carrying out missions deep into enemy-controlled territory. They developed raiding units, sabotage teams, and intelligence networks connecting with other partisan groups. They scouted German supply lines, bridges, telegraph poles, and garrisons. They learned the patrol schedules of collaborationist police. They tracked the movements of German officers who oversaw raids against Jewish communities. The forest settlement was no longer merely surviving. It was beginning to fight back. This transition would define the next phase of their struggle, a phase where the forest fortress became the launch point of daring operations, sabotage missions, liberation actions, and coordinated battles that would change the balance of power across the region. The forest was no longer simply a battlefield. It was becoming a headquarters of resistance.
The forest fortress had survived its first major assault, but survival alone could not sustain a community now numbering in the hundreds. The defenders understood a new, inescapable reality. If they remained purely reactive, hiding, scattering, repelling attacks, the Germans would eventually overwhelm the forest with fire, poison gas, or relentless encirclements. Defense could delay annihilation, but only offense could carve out the space needed to endure. Thus, the camp shifting its doctrine decisively, from fugitives hiding in the woods to partisans shaping the battlefield beyond the trees. The transformation was neither symbolic nor gradual. It was born of the urgent need for food, weapons, medical supplies, and the elimination of nearby threats. The forest could not provide enough sustenance for hundreds, nor could scavenging satisfy long-term needs. Every missing rifle, every bullet fired, every wounded fighter required supplies the forest could not produce. If the camp was to survive, it needed to break outward, disrupt German control, seize resources, and prove that the forest was not a passive sanctuary, but a base of resistance that could strike as effectively as it defended. The first true offensive operation came from necessity. A farmstead on the forest's eastern edge had grain stores that the camp desperately needed before winter. Scouts observed it for days, tracking the farmers' routines, the presence of guards, the comings and goings of collaborators, and whether German patrols passed nearby. The farm was a risk, too exposed, too close to roads used by Germans, but hunger pressed against every decision. The raiding team moved under cover of night, crawling on their bellies through wet grass, waiting for the last lantern to flicker out inside the farmhouse. With silent efficiency, they breached the barn, seized sacks of grain, loaded them onto sleds fashioned from branches, and vanished again into the forest without firing a shot. The next morning, the farmer reported the theft to the local police, but no one could explain how such a daring operation had occurred without any alarm. It was a small victory, but one that proved the forest's fighters could strike and retreat under the enemy's nose. More raids followed: livestock, flour, potatoes, dried meats. But the camp needed more than food. It needed weapons. The forest could not be defended with scavenged rifles forever. So the partisans began targeting German auxiliary units and collaborationist police stations where weapons were less guarded than in major garrisons. Their first such raid targeted a small police outpost on the outskirts of a village. Scouts identified weak points in the structure, the guard schedule, and the location of the weapons locker. The attack unfolded just before dawn. Two fighters approached the front to draw attention, while a second team infiltrated the rear, using a hand axe to break into the storage room. Gunfire erupted briefly as the guards responded, but the defenders' mobility gave them the advantage. Within minutes, the raiding team had seized rifles, ammunition, uniforms, and even a field telephone. They retreated into the forest just as German backup arrived. This operation changed everything. With every rifle taken, another fighter could join the ranks. With every bullet captured, the camp's offensive capacity expanded. The Germans, alarmed by the raid, increased their presence in nearby villages, but this only widened the scope of potential targets. Fuel depots, telegraph lines, supply wagons, and isolated outposts all became vulnerabilities to exploit. The emergence of a new doctrine, targeted sabotage, quickly became central to the camp's strategy. The fighters recognized that striking at German logistics could do more than feed their camp. It could weaken German control of entire regions. Scouts began mapping critical points: railway lines transporting troops and supplies, telegraph poles carrying communications, bridges used by German convoys, and military warehouses storing weapons or uniforms. They studied the timing of supply trains, the number of guards at checkpoints, and the routes used by fuel trucks. With this intelligence, they launched a series of calculated strikes. The first railway sabotage involved removing bolts from a key section of track, causing a supply train to derail at low speed. The operation was subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion of partisans. The Germans initially assumed it was a mechanical failure. But the next attack was unmistakable. A bridge detonated using makeshift explosives constructed in a forest workshop.
The explosion echoed across the countryside, severing a vital supply artery and forcing German units to reroute for miles. The fighters celebrated quietly, knowing that their sabotage had delayed German reinforcements headed toward another front. For the first time, their actions were affecting not only local survival, but the broader war effort. With each successful operation, the camp's fighters grew bolder and more experienced. They learned to coordinate raids with the precision of seasoned soldiers. Every mission had defined roles: scouts to guide the team, forward units to engage guards, infiltration teams to seize weapons or destroy targets, and covering units to hold off pursuit. After-action routines became standardized, counting ammunition expended, redistributing supplies, evaluating mistakes, adjusting tactics. Their training intensified. Fighters practiced firing from prone positions, silent movement over forest litter, retreating in coordinated waves, and using the terrain to outmaneuver larger forces. They drilled for nighttime operations using only moonlight. They practiced breaking contact without leaving tracks. They learned to use the forest as both a shield and a weapon. But the uprising of saboteurs and raiders triggered a predictable German response: reprisals. The Germans were not blind to what was happening. They recognized the growing partisan activity and sought to crush it with overwhelming brutality. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned. Civilians were threatened and executed. The forest was declared an insurgent zone. Patrols doubled. Anti-partisan operations were organized with ruthless efficiency, drawing from German infantry, SS units, and collaborationist police forces. The enemy no longer underestimated the forest dwellers. They wanted to destroy them. One of the earliest major reprisals came after the partisans sabotaged a vital telegraph line connecting a German command post to a regional headquarters. The Germans launched a large-scale sweep through the southern edges of the forest, burning small settlements and rounding up anyone found in the vicinity. The fighters intercepted distress signals from nearby villagers and decided, against great risk, to intervene. They struck the rear of the German formation with rapid ambushes, firing into their supply wagons, cutting off sections of troops, and forcing them to halt their advance. The chaos bought enough time for dozens of villagers to escape into the forest, where they were quickly absorbed into the camp. This operation cemented a new identity. The camp was no longer merely a refuge for Jews fleeing execution. It was a sanctuary for anyone caught in the path of German violence. As their numbers grew, the fighters became more ambitious. They targeted a small German convoy traveling along a forest road, a dangerous mission, but one with potentially massive rewards. The scouts observed that the convoy consisted of a single truck transporting ammunition, escorted by a car carrying officers. The fighters laid an ambush at a bend in the road where the convoy would be forced to slow. They felled a tree across the path just minutes before the vehicles arrived. When the convoy halted, the forest erupted with fire. The officer's vehicle was disabled instantly. The truck driver attempted to reverse but hit a concealed ditch dug days earlier. Within moments, the fighters overwhelmed the escorts, seized the truck, offloaded crates of ammunition, and torched the vehicle before disappearing into the forest. The forest glowed faintly with the blaze of German supplies burning, a symbolic moment as much as a tactical victory. The ammunition from that raid supplied the camp for months. But the partisans knew each victory carried consequences. With each raid, each ambush, each act of sabotage, the Germans grew more determined to eliminate them. Their next major operation reflected this seriousness. A German supply depot near a railway junction was identified as a pivotal target. Destroying it would cripple the German garrison in a nearby town and disrupt operations across the region. Preparation took weeks. Scouts infiltrated the town disguised as locals, mapping guard rotations and supply storage locations. Saboteurs crafted crude but effective explosives from stolen chemicals, metal shrapnel, and gunpowder extracted from captured ammunition. On the night of the operation, the fighters moved into position in complete darkness. A diversionary unit attacked a small checkpoint to draw off guards, while the second team infiltrated the rear, planting explosives beneath a cluster of fuel drums. At precisely 2 a.m., the night sky ignited in a roaring inferno that illuminated the town for miles.
German soldiers rushed to contain the blaze, but the damage was irreversible. Fuel reserves, ammunition crates, and critical equipment were destroyed. The explosion sent shockwaves through the German command structure, prompting urgent investigations and frantic attempts to re-establish supply lines. As their operations expanded, the camp forged connections with other partisan groups scattered across the region. Messengers traveled through the forest to establish communication lines. Joint operations began taking shape, ambushing German patrols together, sharing intelligence, and coordinating sabotage on railway lines. But even among other partisan groups, the forest settlement was unique. It was not merely a band of fighters, but a community, defending hundreds of civilians while waging offensive war. This dual identity demanded extraordinary discipline. Fighters rotated between combat roles and camp duties. Scouts returned to help with construction. Defensive improvements were continual. New bunkers, stronger shelters, decoy camps, and escape routes.
Throughout this expansion, the forest settlement remained invisible to outsiders. Its beating heart was buried beneath the pine needles, emerging only when necessary, striking where least expected, and disappearing again into the shadows. But the fighters understood they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer simply defending themselves. They were shaping the war in their corner of the world. Each ambush, each saboteur's explosion, each convoy seized was a statement. They would not be erased. They would not go quietly. And they would not wait for German annihilation. The forest was no longer merely a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield, and the partisans were learning how to control it.
The forest had been whispering warnings for days before the storm finally broke. Warnings carried by distant engine drones, by unnatural silences on the forest's edges, by sudden disappearances of collaborators from nearby paths, by scouts returning with the same grim message. The Germans were assembling a massive force, larger than anything the partisans had faced before. Rumors spread of units pulled from garrisons across the region, of truckloads of soldiers transported to staging points, of SS detachments joining local police battalions, of artillery units positioned along the forest boundary. Intelligence from nearby villages confirmed the worst. The Germans had launched a full-scale anti-partisan operation, a sweeping retaliation meant to crush all resistance inside the Naliboki Forest, eradicate every partisan stronghold, burn every settlement, purge every Jewish hiding place, and reclaim the forest as a secure rear area. They called it a cleansing operation, a phrase that meant death for anyone unable to flee faster than the German advance. This was not a patrol, not a punitive raid, not an attempt to disrupt supply lines. This was a coordinated, multi-pronged assault intended to break the forest's spine, and with it, the lives of the hundreds of people who depended on the forest's shadows for survival. At dawn on the first day of the operation, the defenders heard it, the distant thunder of artillery shells slamming into the forest canopy, lighting the treetops with explosions, sending birds scattering in frantic clouds. The Germans were using artillery to soften the forest before infantry moved in, hoping to panic the hidden partisans into revealing their positions. Shells crashed through branches, detonating on the forest floor in bursts of dirt, flame, and splintered wood. The ground trembled with each blast. Trees fell in groaning arcs. Within minutes, the outer edges of the forest were burning, pillars of smoke rising like black monuments to the oncoming storm. The camp's fighters immediately implemented their evacuation protocol. Non-combatants were ushered deeper into the forest under guard, following predetermined escape corridors shielded by the densest undergrowth. Fighters prepared fallback lines, scattering into their pre-assigned ambush locations. Fire crews rushed to smother burning foliage that could betray positions. The forest, usually quiet, predictable, became a battlefield of smoke, flame, and tension. Then the infantry came. The German attack unfolded in waves. The first wave consisted of collaborationist police sweeping the outer forest, searching for fugitives and marking paths for the units behind them. The second wave comprised German infantry, advancing in lines, rifles raised, grenades at the ready, accompanied by machine gun teams who fired into thick brush at the slightest rustle. The third wave, the most feared, was formed by SS units, tasked with hunting down and killing partisans with ruthless precision. These three waves moved in coordinated formations, meant to close off all escape routes, compress the forest inward, and trap the defenders in an ever-tightening circle. But the forest partisans were ready. Scouts signaled the approach using prearranged taps and bird calls. Fighters concealed in dugouts watched through narrow slits as the German front line advanced. Then, at the perfect moment, they struck. Not in a frontal defense, but from the flanks where the German formation was most vulnerable. The opening ambush was devastating. A burst of rifle fire from concealed positions, followed by 2 grenades hurled into the center of the advancing line. Germans fell, shouting orders, returning fire blindly into the trees. Before they could reorganize, the partisans were already gone, melting back into deeper positions, leaving behind confusion and bodies. The hit-and-run tactic stalled the German advance just long enough to disrupt their planned timing. But the Germans adapted quickly. Officers barked commands, machine gun teams repositioned, and the infantry pressed forward with brutal determination. The forest's defenders realized instantly that this would not be a battle won through a single ambush. It would be a relentless, shifting fight for survival. As the day progressed, the Germans brought in new weapons, flamethrower teams. These units advanced after the infantry, spraying jets of fire into suspected hiding spots, setting entire sections of undergrowth ablaze. The flames roared through dry brush, consuming camouflage shelters and tearing through natural choke points the partisans had spent months perfecting. The defenders countered with dirt buckets and water doused on flames, but the fire spread too quickly. The forest, their sanctuary, was turning against them. Smoke thickened, obscuring vision. Sparks rained like fiery snow. Amid this inferno, the partisans fought not only the Germans, but the advancing wall of fire itself. Yet amidst the chaos, the defenders' tactical discipline held. They executed a rolling retreat, fighting from position to position, slowing the German advance through tactical withdrawals and sporadic ambushes designed to confuse and demoralize the attackers. Every ridge, every stream, every fallen tree became a defensive line. Fighters covered one another's movements, retreating only when the enemy's bullets cracked inches overhead. The forest became a labyrinth of shifting combat, moments of sudden violence followed by eerie silence as fighters repositioned. German units, forced to move cautiously through smoke-choked terrain, lost cohesion. Their dogs struggled in the heat and fumes. Communication faltered as officers shouted contradictory orders. But still the attack pressed on, driven by German insistence on crushing the forest resistance once and for all. By afternoon, the Germans achieved the breakthrough they wanted. They penetrated the outer defenses and reached the first ring of abandoned shelters. They stormed them aggressively, only to find them empty. Partisans had moved their families deeper into secondary camps hours earlier. Furious, the Germans torched the shelters, the flames rising into columns of smoke visible for miles. They saw the empty bunkers as evidence that the fugitives were on the run and pressed deeper with renewed fury. But the defenders had planned for this too. At nightfall, when the Germans expected the partisans to be exhausted, scattered, demoralized, the forest fighters launched a counterattack. Under the cover of darkness, they struck an isolated German platoon attempting to set up a forward position. The ambush was swift and devastating. Silent movement, close-quarter fire, and knives where rifles were too loud, and the use of darkness as a weapon. The Germans were routed, leaving behind ammunition and valuable intelligence documents. But the cost was high. 2 fighters wounded, 1 dead. Even so, the counterattack bought time. The defenders regrouped, redistributed weapons, and prepared for the next day. The second day of the German sweep was worse. Reinforcements arrived, new units deployed deeper, more flamethrowers were used. The Germans attempted to cordon off the forest entirely, sealing the northern exits and pushing from the south. The defenders had no illusions. If they stayed in one area too long, they would be encircled and annihilated. so the forest became their weapon again. The partisans executed what would later be recognized as one of the most complex withdrawal and evade maneuvers of any partisan group in the region. They split into small mobile groups, each following different escape corridors, breaking the camp into multiple battalions moving along pre-mapped paths. The Germans attempted to follow, but their terrain slowed them, and the partisans, their senses honed by months of living in the forest, moved with fluidity that German infantry could not match. The crucial moment came late on the second day of the German forest sweep. The German forces attempted to seal the eastern corridor, the most critical exit route. Had they succeeded, hundreds of non-combatants would have been trapped. Recognizing the threat instantly, the fighters launched their boldest operation yet, a direct assault on the encircling German line. It was a desperate move, open confrontation without the full cover of forest concealment, but there was no alternative. If the encirclement closed, the camp would die. The battle for the eastern corridor raged in a maelstrom of bullets, smoke, and shouted commands. The fighters struck first, firing from multiple angles to disrupt German formation. The Germans returned fire with machine guns, cutting branches and sending splinters flying. Fighters dashed from tree to tree, closing distance, flanking from both sides. 2 grenades thrown at perfect trajectory took out a machine gun nest. A flank unit hit the Germans from behind, causing their line to fracture. And in that moment of chaos, seconds long but decisive, the civilians poured through the corridor, rushing deeper into the safety of thick marshland. The fighters held the line until the last families had passed. Then, under covering fire, they slipped back into the forest, leaving the Germans furious, disoriented, and unable to pursue effectively. By the end of the third day, the Germans abandoned the sweep. The forest had survived, but victory had come at a price. Shelters destroyed, food caches burned, dozens wounded, and the harsh realization that the Germans would return. But the battle had proven the partisans' resilience. They could withstand a full-scale German sweep. They could fight, withdraw, regroup, and fight again. Their command structure had strengthened. Their mobility had saved them. And the German commanders, despite their fury, had learned a bitter truth. The forest could not be conquered, and the people within it could not be broken. The great retaliation had failed, but the war for the forest was far from over.
The forest had withstood the greatest assault the Germans could muster, and though the price had been severe, something fundamental had changed. The camp was no longer simply reacting to the enemy's aggression. It was shaping the battlefield. The vast sweep had taught the partisans more about German capabilities, patterns, and weaknesses than any scouting patrol ever could. They now understood how the enemy assembled, how they moved through dense terrain, how they responded to ambushes, how their lines fractured under pressure, and how easily their coordination collapsed when struck at the right moment. The Germans had attempted to crush the forest with overwhelming force and had failed. Now it was the forest's turn to dictate the terms of engagement. The transformation from isolated defenders to strategists capable of orchestrating complex operations did not happen in a single moment, but grew organically from necessity, opportunity, and hard-earned experience. The fighters gathered in council after the German retreat, their faces smeared with soot and exhaustion, their minds still buzzing with tension and adrenaline. They studied maps drawn from memory, debated tactics, evaluated losses, and recalibrated strategy. What emerged from these councils was a bold new doctrine. The forest would not wait for the next German sweep. The forest would strike first. In the wake of the failed encirclement, German forces were unsettled. Reports from officers were filled with frustration and confusion. The enemy disappears into the trees. They do not hold positions. Their numbers are unclear. They strike from unexpected angles. Our dogs lose their scent. Their defenses shift faster than we can advance. These reports signaled to the partisans that the Germans were vulnerable, psychologically, logistically, and strategically. Morale among the attackers had been fractured. Some units refused to return to the forest without reinforcements. Patrols were reduced in size and frequency as officers grew wary of losing men to ambushes. This retreat, though temporary, created openings the partisans were eager to exploit. Their first offensive was aimed not at a guarded target, but at a soft one.
a German supply column traveling a road just beyond the forest's western edge. The column, laden with food, ammunition, and medical supplies, traveled with minimal escort, reflecting the German assumption that the forest inhabitants were too busy recovering to mount an attack. They were wrong. The ambush was planned with the precision of a military unit. Scouts observed the convoy route for days. They selected an S-shaped bend in the road where vehicles slowed naturally, a perfect kill zone. Under cover of darkness, fighters dragged logs across alternate paths to funnel the convoy into the ambush point. They positioned riflemen on a ridge overlooking the bend, grenadiers behind concealed brush piles, and readied a blocking team to seal the convoy's retreat. When the lead truck reached the bend at dawn, a rope snapped taut across the road, flipping it onto its side. Before the Germans inside could orient themselves, the forest erupted in fire. Grenades exploded beneath the second escort vehicle. Rifle fire cut down drivers attempting to flee. Shouts echoed through the trees as German soldiers scrambled for cover. But within minutes, the battle was over. The partisans swarmed the immobilized trucks, seizing crates of ammunition, medicine, field rations, blankets, items essential to sustaining their settlement through the coming winter. The operation was executed so swiftly that by the time a distant outpost heard the faint echo of gunfire, the fighters had vanished back into the trees, leaving only smoldering wreckage behind. This success emboldened them. It demonstrated conclusively that the forest could project force beyond its borders, that the Germans could not operate with impunity in the region's supply network, and that the settlement could support itself not only through survival tactics, but through strategic offensive operations. The fighters escalated their ambitions. Now they eyed German communication lines, the vital arteries that connected command posts, transported orders, coordinated troop movements, and reported partisan activity. Disrupting these lines would disorient German forces and slow their capacity to respond to threats. The first communication strike targeted a telegraph station serving as a relay between two regional command centers. The station was lightly guarded, its operators complacent. The partisans approached silently at dawn, slipped past the lone sentry, cut the lines, disabled the equipment, and set the structure ablaze before any alarm could be raised. By the time German reinforcements arrived, the telegraph station was a charred ruin, and the forest partisans were already miles away. But the more ambitious operations lay ahead. Word spread through the forest that the Germans were planning a second ghetto liquidation in a town east of the forest, an operation that threatened hundreds of Jews still trapped in urban confinement. For the partisans, this presented a moral and strategic challenge. They could not launch a frontal attack against German garrison forces. Such an action would be suicidal. But they could undermine the operation by ambushing the German detachment tasked with transporting the victims. After extensive scouting, the fighters identified a narrow stretch of road flanked by dense vegetation, an ideal ambush site. When the German trucks approached, flanked by armed escorts, the forest exploded with coordinated violence. The first volley of rifle fire took out the front vehicle, blocking the convoy. Grenades rained onto the rear escorts. Panicked soldiers attempted to flee into the trees, only to be met by hidden fighters. The battle was brutal and swift. When it was over, the partisans swarmed the immobilized trucks, seizing crates of ammunition, medicine, field rations, blankets, items essential to sustaining their settlement through the coming winter. The operation was executed so swiftly that by the time a distant outpost heard the faint echo of gunfire, the fighters had vanished back into the trees, leaving only smoldering wreckage behind. This success emboldened them. It demonstrated conclusively that the forest could project force beyond its borders, that the Germans could not operate with impunity in the region's supply network, and that the settlement could support itself not only through survival tactics, but through strategic offensive operations. The fighters escalated their ambitions. Now they eyed German communication lines, the vital arteries that connected command posts, transported orders, coordinated troop movements, and reported partisan activity. Disrupting these lines would disorient German forces and slow their capacity to respond to threats. The first communication strike targeted a telegraph station serving as a relay between two regional command centers. The station was lightly guarded, its operators complacent. The partisans approached silently at dawn, slipped past the lone sentry, cut the lines, disabled the equipment, and set the structure ablaze before any alarm could be raised. By the time German reinforcements arrived, the telegraph station was a charred ruin, and the forest partisans were already miles away. But the more ambitious operations lay ahead. Word spread through the forest that the Germans were planning a second ghetto liquidation in a town east of the forest, an operation that threatened hundreds of Jews still trapped in urban confinement. For the partisans, this presented a moral and strategic challenge. They could not launch a frontal attack against German garrison forces, such an action would be suicidal. But they could undermine the operation by ambushing the German detachment tasked with transporting the victims. After extensive scouting, the fighters identified a narrow stretch of road flanked by dense vegetation, an ideal ambush site. When the German trucks approached, flanked by armed escorts, the forest exploded with coordinated violence. The first volley of rifle fire took out the front vehicle, blocking the convoy. Grenades rained onto the rear escorts. Panicked soldiers attempted to flee into the trees, only to be met by hidden fighters. The battle was brutal and swift. When it was over, the partisans swarmed the immobilized trucks, seizing crates of ammunition, medicine, field rations, blankets, items essential to sustaining their settlement through the coming winter. The operation was executed so swiftly that by the time a distant outpost heard the faint echo of gunfire, the fighters had vanished back into the trees, leaving only smoldering wreckage behind. This success emboldened them. It demonstrated conclusively that the forest could project force beyond its borders, that the Germans could not operate with impunity in the region's supply network, and that the settlement could support itself not only through survival tactics but through strategic offensive operations. The fighters escalated their ambitions. Now they eyed German communication lines, the vital arteries that connected command posts, transported orders, coordinated troop movements, and reported partisan activity. Disrupting these lines would disorient German forces and slow their capacity to respond to threats. The first communication strike targeted a telegraph station serving as a relay between two regional command centers. The station was lightly guarded, its operators complacent. The partisans approached silently at dawn, slipped past the lone sentry, cut the lines, disabled the equipment, and set the structure ablaze before any alarm could be raised. By the time German reinforcements arrived, the telegraph station was a charred ruin, and the forest partisans were already miles away. But the more ambitious operations lay ahead. Word spread through the forest that the Germans were planning a second ghetto liquidation in a town east of the forest, an operation that threatened hundreds of Jews still trapped in urban confinement. To the partisans, this presented a moral and strategic challenge. They could not launch a frontal attack against German garrison forces, such an action would be suicidal. But they could undermine the operation by ambushing the German detachment tasked with transporting the victims. After extensive scouting, the fighters identified a narrow stretch of road flanked by dense vegetation, an ideal ambush site. When the German trucks approached, flanked by armed escorts, the forest exploded with coordinated violence. The first volley of rifle fire took out the front vehicle, blocking the convoy. Grenades rained onto the rear escorts. Panicked soldiers attempted to flee into the trees, only to be met by hidden fighters. The battle was brutal and swift. When it was over, the partisans swarmed the immobilized trucks, seizing crates of ammunition, medicine, field rations, blankets, items essential to sustaining their settlement through the coming winter. The operation was executed so swiftly that by the time a distant outpost heard the faint echo of gunfire, the fighters had vanished back into the trees, leaving only smoldering wreckage behind. This success emboldened them. It demonstrated conclusively that the forest could project force beyond its borders, that the Germans could not operate with impunity in the region's supply network, and that the settlement could support itself not only through survival tactics, but through strategic offensive operations. The fighters escalated their ambitions. Now they eyed German communication lines, the vital arteries that connected command posts, transported orders, coordinated troop movements, and reported partisan activity. Disrupting these lines would disorient German forces and slow their capacity to respond to threats. The first communication strike targeted a telegraph station serving as a relay between two regional command centers. The station was lightly guarded, its operators complacent. The partisans approached silently at dawn, slipped past the lone sentry, cut the lines, disabled the equipment, and set the structure ablaze before any alarm could be raised. By the time German reinforcements arrived, The telegraph station was a charred ruin, and the forest partisans were already miles away. But the more ambitious operations lay ahead. Word spread through the forest that the Germans were planning a second ghetto liquidation in a town east of the forest, an operation that threatened hundreds of Jews still trapped in urban confinement. For the partisans, this presented a moral and strategic challenge. They could not launch a frontal attack against German garrison forces. Such an action would be suicidal. But they could undermine the operation by ambushing the German detachment tasked with transporting the victims. After extensive scouting, the fighters identified a narrow stretch of road flanked by dense vegetation, an ideal ambush site. When the German trucks approached, flanked by armed escorts, the forest exploded with coordinated violence. The first volley of rifle fire took out the front vehicle, blocking the convoy. Grenades rained onto the rear escorts. Panicked soldiers attempted to flee into the trees, only to be met by hidden fighters. The battle was brutal and swift. When it was over, the partisans opened the truck gates, shouting urgently for the captives to run into the forest. Dozens escaped, sprinting into the undergrowth, joining the tidal wave of humanity seeking refuge beneath the trees. Others, too weak or terrified to move, were carried by fighters into the safety of the forest's shadows. This operation, though costly, marked a turning point. The forest was no longer just a refuge. It had become a force of liberation. The success of these operations attracted the attention of other partisan units in the region. Some were Soviet-affiliated, others independent nationalist groups. Many were surprised to discover that the forest settlement, assumed by many to be a fragile cluster of non-combatants, was in fact a disciplined fighting force capable of executing complex missions. Communication channels opened, messengers exchanged intelligence, joint operations were planned. Though alliances were often precarious, held together by mutual necessity rather than trust, the benefits were undeniable. Larger raids became possible. Targets once considered unreachable now lay within operational range. The first major joint operation between the forest partisans and a neighboring Soviet partisan brigade targeted a German fuel depot near a strategic railway hub. The depot was heavily guarded, but the two partisan groups coordinated meticulously. The forest fighters would create a diversionary ambush along a supply road, drawing German reinforcements away from the depot, while the Soviet brigade infiltrated the perimeter and planted explosives. On the chosen night, the plan unfolded with astonishing precision. The forest fighters struck the supply convoy with overwhelming speed, creating a prolonged firefight that drew nearly every German unit from the depot into the unfolding chaos. Meanwhile, the Soviet brigade slipped into the now understaffed depot and rigged the fuel tanks. When the explosions came, they lit the sky in a fiery glow visible from the treetops miles away. The blast shook the ground beneath the fleeing fighters' feet. The fuel depot was destroyed, crippling German movement in the region for weeks. This operation solidified the forest settlement's reputation among other partisan groups. They were no longer seen as a desperate community of fugitives, but as a formidable guerrilla force capable of executing complex missions. Their fighters had proved themselves in ambushes, sabotage missions, supply raids, and liberation operations. Their knowledge of the forest gave them unmatched mobility. Their willingness to protect civilians earned them respect among locals. Their resilience under German assault inspired hope in thousands. As the months stretched into seasons, the forest became a hive of coordinated resistance activity. German outposts were struck repeatedly. Patrols dwindled as soldiers refused to enter the forest. Recruitment increased as more fugitives, villagers, and escaped POWs learned of the forest stronghold's growing power. The camp expanded its tactical infrastructure. New bunkers were built deeper within the forest. Workshops forged traps, repaired weapons, and manufactured improvised explosives. A medical corps grew using herbs, stolen supplies, and captured equipment to treat wounded fighters. Communication lines expanded between forest units. Patrol routes extended for miles, forming an invisible network of vigilance. The forest was no longer a battlefield. It was becoming a command center of resistance. But with growing influence came new dangers. The Germans would not ignore the forest's transformation forever. Their next retaliation would be fiercer, larger, more organized.
The forest partisans knew this. They could feel it in the tension of their scouts' reports, in the increased sightings of German engineers surveying roads, and in the sudden silence of villages that once whispered with warnings. The enemy was preparing. The forest would be tested again, and the next battle would determine not just the survival of the camp, but the fate of the entire resistance network in the region.
Winter arrived not as a season, but as an assault, an enemy as relentless as any German column, as unforgiving as any SS detachment, and as lethal as bullets fired in the dark. Snow fell in heavy sheets, burying trails, weighing down branches until they snapped under the strain, and transforming the forest into a world of white silence where every breath hung like a ghost in the air. Ice crusted the streams, bark peeled from trees in brittle curls, and the cold penetrated shelters like steel needles. The partisans had braced for winter, but nothing could truly prepare a forest community of over 1,000 people, fighters, families, elderly, children, for the brutality of the Eastern European cold. Food stores dwindled with unsettling speed. Fires, necessary for survival, risked exposing their location through stray columns of smoke. Movement became laborious. Snow betrayed footprints instantly. Weapons jammed from frost. Even the forest animals grew scarce, driven deeper into the woods or killed by the cold. The partisans, hardened by battles against armed enemies, now faced a different kind of war, one of attrition, endurance, and staggering deprivation. But winter also brought opportunity and danger. German patrols, while less frequent, became deadly in their desperation. The Germans knew that winter was the moment when the forest settlement was at its most vulnerable, when hunger and frost weakened resolve, when tracks in the snow revealed hidden paths, and when the sound of a single axe could carry for miles. So they planned their winter operations with brutal efficiency. The first attack came in early December, when a German ski detachment, silent, fast, dressed in winter camouflage, entered the forest from the north following a trail accidentally revealed by a family fleeing a burning village. The partisans detected them too late. The Germans moved quickly, slicing through the trees like phantoms, their rifles wrapped in cloth to silence clicks, their movements perfectly adapted to snow. They aimed not for open battle, but for a surprise strike on the camp's outer shelters. But as they approached the first ring, a young scout spotted them, a faint flicker of white movement against the trees, and signaled the alarm with a clipped bird call that pierced the forest's stillness. In seconds, the camp mobilized. Fighters scrambled to their positions, rifles shaking in their frozen hands. The Germans reached the first shelter cluster and opened fire, bullets tearing through bark and snow. But the defenders responded with rapid, precise shots from behind concealed embankments. The battle exploded in the eerie quiet of winter. Flashes of muzzle fire, the thunder of grenades muffled by snow, shouts echoing through the cold air. Within minutes, the Germans were pinned down, unprepared for the tenacity of defenders who refused to surrender their winter refuge. The ski detachment withdrew in disarray, leaving behind bodies and frozen tracks leading back into the white expanse. But this was only the beginning. Over the next weeks, the Germans launched repeated winter sweeps, small, specialized units designed to harass, disorient, and starve the partisans. They destroyed food caches, discovered by following tracks in snow. They burned remote shelters. They ambushed foraging parties forced to venture dangerously close to the forest's edges. The partisans responded with increasing caution, breaking camp into smaller cells, hiding supplies in dozens of locations, and moving constantly to avoid detection. The forest settlement, once a centralized hub, became a shifting constellation of shelters, lookouts, and hidden stores. Fighters traveled in pairs, never alone, always stepping in each other's footprints to reduce trail density. But even with these precautions, food shortages became dire. People boiled leather strips for nutrition. Children dug through snow in search of edible roots. Hunters spent days tracking a single animal. Hunger gnawed at morale, and the sound of the wind whistling through frozen branches became a grim reminder of nature's indifference. Yet even in starvation, the obligation to protect civilians remained paramount.
When word reached the camp that a nearby village was facing imminent German retaliation for suspected partisan support, the fighters faced an agonizing decision: risk their lives and scarce ammunition to defend the villagers, or remain hidden and preserve strength for their own community. The decision took moments. They would defend. Under cover of night, a team of fighters trekked through waist-deep snow, their breath freezing on their scarves, their rifles wrapped in cloth to prevent frostbite on metal. They reached the village as the first German trucks approached. The battle that unfolded was as brutal as the cold itself. Short-range firefights in narrow lanes, grenades thrown from behind snowbanks, German soldiers slipping on ice as partisans emerged from shadows. They aimed for officers and drivers. The Germans, unprepared for such resistance in winter, faltered. The village was saved, temporarily, but the cost was severe. Ammunition expended, fighters wounded, and the Germans, humiliated, vowed revenge. This retaliation came days later. The Germans launched a winter siege, not a full sweep like the previous summer, but a relentless harassment campaign designed to choke the forest to death. They surrounded the outer regions, cutting off access to villages. They set traps near known foraging areas. They deployed aircraft on clear days to scan for smoke from hidden fires. They placed mines in narrow clearings. They hung captured partisans on trees as warnings. The forest settlement was cornered not by a single decisive blow, but by constant pressure. Each day became a battle for survival. And yet through this suffering, the forest partisans discovered new strengths. Their scouts grew sharper, tracking enemy movement with uncanny precision. Their fighters learned to adapt weapons for extreme cold, keeping rifles under clothing until the last moment to prevent frost jamming. They constructed underground fire pits with ventilation tunnels that dispersed smoke invisibly through snowbanks. They created decoy trails branching from real ones, leading Germans into frozen swamps or towards concealed traps. The forest itself, though harsh, became their shield once more, its complexity and vastness overwhelming German attempts to control it. The turning point came during one of the coldest nights of the winter. German forces, following old tracks, attempted a surprise encirclement of a secondary camp location, estimated to house dozens of civilians. The attack would have been devastating, but a forward scout spotted the movement hours before it reached the camp and rushed through snowdrifts to warn the defenders. What followed was a feat of coordination few conventional armies could match. In the dead of night, in temperatures dropping below -20 degrees Celsius, the entire camp relocated silently through the forest's thickest undergrowth, abandoning shelters, carrying children and wounded through knee-deep snow, extinguishing every trace of their presence. The fighters stayed behind, setting up a web of defensive positions designed not to stop the Germans, but to stall them just long enough for the vulnerable to escape. When the Germans reached the camp, they found it empty. But the defenders unleashed a barrage from multiple angles, retreating after each volley. Confused, believing they had encountered a larger force, the Germans reorganized, losing precious time. The partisans used every second to shift deeper into untouched forest, guiding civilians across frozen marshes and through stands of thick spruce. When the Germans finally realized the camp was not worth pursuing deeper, the defenders vanished, regrouping with the civilians in a pre-designated location miles away. The winter siege had failed. In the following weeks, the partisans found new ways to survive. They established snow caches, buried supply depots, preserved by ice. They created ice shelters insulated by pine boughs. They used frozen streams as swift, stealthy highways for quick movement. When a German unit established a temporary outpost near the forest's edge, the partisans carried out a daring assault at dusk, overwhelming the guards and seizing food stores. This raid, risky but essential, provided enough resources to carry the camp through the harshest stretch of winter. The forest settlement survived not because it was strong, but because it was adaptable, shifting, learning, enduring. By the time the first thaw came, the forest partisans had done the impossible. They had survived the winter, repelled multiple German offensives, protected civilians, expanded their operational territory, and preserved their will to fight. The Germans, exhausted and frustrated, withdrew from winter operations, leaving behind scattered outposts and empty threats. The siege was over. The forest was bruised, burned, clawed by frost, but it remained alive. The people within it remained defiant. Winter had been an enemy. But in defeating it, the forest partisans became stronger than ever.
The winter siege had not broken the forest. It had reforged it, hardening the resolve of everyone within its depths and marking the beginning of a new phase in their struggle, one defined not by mere survival, but by growing momentum. As snow melted and the first hints of spring seeped into the earth, the partisans rose from the harsh season sharper, leaner, and more strategically formidable than ever before. What emerged from the winter was no longer simply a hidden community or a cluster of shelters shielding fugitives. It was a mobile army, fueled by experience, armed with captured German weapons, hardened by months of cold, and increasingly coordinated with neighboring partisan detachments. And beyond the forest, beyond the invisible perimeter that had contained their world for so long, something seismic was shifting. The German war machine, once unstoppable, was beginning to falter under the pressure of defeats on distant fronts. News trickled into the forest through scattered rumors, captured documents, refugee whispers, and Soviet messengers. Stalingrad had fallen. Kursk was turning against the Germans, and the Red Army was pushing westward with devastating force. For the first time, the forest partisans felt the tremors of a turning tide. The enemy was still dangerous, still ruthless, still capable of brutality, but no longer invincible. The forest, once isolated and besieged, found itself suddenly positioned in a region where German lines were weakening, supply chains were overextended, and morale was cracking. In this shifting landscape, the partisans saw their greatest opportunity yet, not just to survive the war, but to actively shape its final chapters. Spring gave way to movement everywhere. Birds returned to the canopy. Streams ran fast and cold. Underbrush thickened, offering fresh concealment. And with the thaw came openings for operations impossible during winter. Ambushes near thawing roads, raids on garrisons weakened by redeployment, sabotage of bridges essential to German retreats. The forest partisans launched a series of synchronized strikes, each planned with greater precision than the last. Their first target was a German checkpoint controlling access to a supply route between two garrisons. Scouts reported that the post was lightly guarded due to the recent withdrawal of forces to the Eastern Front. Recognizing this as an opportunity to seize weapons and disrupt communications, the partisans staged a night infiltration. They crawled through wet undergrowth, bypassed the outer watchtower by timing the guards' pacing pattern, and reached the internal perimeter without detection. From there, silence was their weapon. Knives flashed, muffled grunts faded into the darkness. Rifles were taken before they could be fired. Within minutes, the checkpoint fell. The fighters quickly stripped it of supplies, rifles, ammunition, maps, radios, and then destroyed the structure with explosives. A plume of smoke rose above the treetops, a symbol of their growing reach. This success fed into a broader strategy taking shape, weakened German control of the region not through frontal assaults, but through 1,000 cuts, targeting fuel depots, telegraph lines, small garrisons, roads, and officers. Each blow, though modest in isolation, collectively strained German manpower and eroded their ability to respond to larger Soviet advances. The forest partisans became a thorn embedded deep in the German rear, a constant disruption that diverted units, sowed confusion, and forced the enemy to fight battles on ground where every tree, ridge, and marsh favored the locals. But as operations expanded, so did the responsibilities. Increasing numbers of Jews escaped ghettos or transports fleeing into the forest with terror in their eyes and frost still clinging to their clothes. Others emerged from hiding places in cellars and barns as German authority weakened. Some were liberated by partisan raids on work camps or transport trucks. The forest settlement swelled again, pushing the limits of shelter capacity, food reserves, and infrastructure. The fighters, tasked with protecting these people, now carried the burden of a dual role, military and humanitarian, all while continuing to wage guerrilla war. To sustain such pressure, the camp reorganized once more.
Leadership established new work brigades focused on cultivating hidden forest gardens, boiling down tree sap for nutrients, repairing clothing, and constructing deeper, more fortified shelters capable of housing newcomers. Patrol networks expanded. Workshops manufactured explosives using salvaged metal and chemicals extracted from German ordnance. Blacksmiths forged tools and sharpened knives. Medics refined treatments for battlefield injuries using herbs and captured supplies. The forest had become a small city, one whose survival depended on constant readiness. The growing partisan strength attracted increasing Soviet attention. Messages arrived from commanders of Red Army units approaching the region. These messages were terse, factual, and urgent: disrupt German retreats, sabotage rail lines, attack rear positions, and prepare to assist Soviet advances into Belarus. The partisans welcomed the contact, not out of ideological alignment, but because cooperation served mutual survival. They began coordinating supply routes, sharing maps, transmitting intelligence, and planning joint strikes. Soviet partisan units, larger and better armed, respected the forest fighters for their discipline and effectiveness. This alliance marked a turning point. The forest, once isolated and besieged, found itself suddenly positioned in a region where German lines were weakening, supply chains were overextended, and morale was cracking. The first joint operation of this new phase targeted a German garrison stationed in a small town controlling a crucial road used by retreating Wehrmacht units. The objective was not to seize the town, but to disrupt the garrison long enough to hinder German movement in the region. The plan required perfect timing. Soviet units approached from the east, while forest partisans moved from the west through an overgrown drainage ditch that provided natural cover. At dusk, signals were exchanged, quick flashes of reflected light from a mirror, and the attack began. Explosions shattered the quiet as Soviet partisans detonated charges against the garrison's perimeter. German soldiers rushed outside, firing wildly, only to be flanked by forest fighters emerging from the ditch. The battle turned chaotic. Smoke mixed with the last light of sunset. Rifle bursts echoed through narrow streets, and shadows danced across broken walls. The joint force overwhelmed the garrison, destroyed its communication equipment, seized weapons, and withdrew before German reinforcements arrived. The damage was severe enough that the Germans abandoned the town days later, leaving behind stores that the partisans quickly moved into the forest. But not all operations were victories. One of the most harrowing moments of this period came when scouts reported that a small work camp holding dozens of Jewish prisoners was marked for liquidation. The camp was too heavily guarded to be stormed directly, and time was dangerously short. The Germans no longer delayed when deciding to murder prisoners. The partisans devised a bold plan: attack the convoy transporting the prisoners to the execution site rather than the camp itself. The ambush took place on a forest road bordered by dense pines. Fighters concealed explosives beneath fallen branches. As the convoy approached, 2 trucks and a small escort, the lead truck triggered the charge. The explosion lifted it off the ground, flipping it onto its side. The escort vehicle halted abruptly, and the partisans opened fire from both sides. The firefight was intense, but brief. When the gunfire faded, the fighters approached the second truck, pulled open the doors, and helped the stunned survivors, weak, starving, but alive, into the safety of the woods. It was an emotional victory, but one tempered by the knowledge that the Germans, enraged, would retaliate. Retaliation came swiftly. The German forces conducted another sweep, smaller than the Great Siege, but brutal nonetheless. The partisans responded with the tactics they had perfected: hit-and-run tactics, decoy trails, and night withdrawals. They lost shelters, cachets, even a few fighters, but the forest held, and the Germans, demoralized by extended fighting on multiple fronts, lacked the stamina for a prolonged campaign. Their siege collapsed in days, not weeks. As summer approached, the Soviets closed in from the east with increasing force. Rumors of massive offensives, Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, filtered into the forest. The Germans, stretched thin, began abandoning outer positions, leaving behind booby traps, mines, and isolated pockets of resistance. Roads once patrolled by armed convoys became empty. Villages once terrified of German occupation saw soldiers retreat in disarray. For the forest partisans, this was the moment they had been preparing for. The collapse of German control created openings for liberation missions on a scale previously unimaginable. The fighters accelerated their operations. They dismantled rail lines used for German retreats. They destroyed bridges. They ambushed straggling units. They liberated work camps. They escorted refugees through forest paths to safe zones. Every day brought new movement, new targets, new responsibilities. The forest settlement, once hidden, now moved outward with purpose. Reconnaissance teams ranged farther than ever before. Fighters marched alongside Soviet units to guide them through treacherous terrain. And as the Soviet front drew closer, the thunder of distant artillery became a daily presence, rolling across the land like a promise of approaching change. By the time Soviet forces reached the forest edge, the partisans had already weakened the Germans through months of coordinated attacks. The final German positions crumbled rapidly. When Soviet units advanced into the region, they found not a desolate, crushed landscape, but a forest alive with fighters who had been holding the line for years. The partisans emerged from the trees to greet the advancing troops, armed, organized, scarred by battle and winter, but unbroken. For the first time, the forest was no longer surrounded by enemies. For the first time, the tide had decisively turned in their favor. The liberation had begun.
The end, when it came, did not arrive as a single moment of triumph, nor as a dramatic clash beneath the pines, but as a steady, thunderous wave pushing westward. Soviet artillery, tank columns, infantry regiments sweeping across Belarus and crushing German formations that had once seemed unshakable. By the time the Red Army neared the Naliboki Forest, the air itself vibrated with the rumble of distant guns, each blast rolling across the landscape like a heartbeat, signaling the approaching collapse of Nazi control. The forest partisans, who had spent years fighting in shadows, suddenly found the world shifting in broad daylight. German patrols that once prowled the forest with arrogant ease began to shrink in size and frequency. Roadblocks were abandoned. Bridges were rigged for demolition but left unguarded. Supply convoys, once predictable targets, vanished altogether as the Germans rerouted everything toward desperate defensive lines. Villages, once terrorized into silence, now whispered of German retreats, of officers burning documents, of collaborators fleeing in the night. The forest settlement, which had survived siege after siege, winter after winter, now stood at the edge of history, watching as the war pressed in from all sides. But the end of German control did not mean safety. If anything, this was the most dangerous moment of all. Retreating German units had begun adopting a scorched earth policy. Burning villages, destroying railroads, massacring civilians, planting mines along roads and forest paths. Any place the forest fighters moved risked stepping into a trap left behind by a fleeing army desperate to leave nothing useful to the enemy. The partisans tightened patrols and advanced cautiously, scouting new areas before civilians were allowed to move. But even caution could not erase the inherent danger. The collapse of a retreating force is chaotic and lethal. German units, demoralized, exhausted, increasingly irrational, fired at anything that moved. Some squads, knowing their war was lost, turned to pure brutality in their final days on Belarusian soil. The forest partisans knew they still had work to do. The war had not ended for them simply because the tide had turned. Instead, the forest prepared itself for its final, most decisive action, to protect its people during the collapse of the enemy occupying their homeland. The first crucial operation came when scouts reported that a German rearguard unit had established a temporary stronghold in a village near the forest's southern edge, intending to execute the inhabitants before burning it to the ground. The partisans acted with speed sharpened by years of crisis. They assembled a multi-pronged strike team coordinating with a Soviet detachment moving through the area. As dawn approached, the partisans attacked from the tree line in a sudden eruption of rifle fire. Germans scrambled to respond, firing blindly into the forest as the partisans advanced in staggered waves. A Soviet mortar team provided devastating support, sending shells crashing into the German defensive perimeter. Within minutes, the enemy line broke. Some Germans attempted to flee, others surrendered, but most were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the assault. When the smoke cleared, the villagers emerged from their homes in shock, alive, shaken, and staring at the fighters who had saved them. The partisans, exhausted and mud-covered, ushered them toward the forest, guiding them through paths that only the locals of the hidden settlement could navigate. Another pocket of life preserved, another atrocity prevented. But the most significant operation of this final period came weeks later, when retreating SS forces attempted to burn out a swath of the forest to flush out any remaining partisans and destroy potential hiding places before Soviet troops arrived. The fire teams, equipped with fuel canisters, torches, and grenades, moved toward the forest's eastern boundary with chilling efficiency. Had they succeeded, the forest settlement, still housing families, elderly, and children, would have been wiped out in an inferno. The partisans could not allow this. They mobilized instantly, forming 4 attack groups to strike the German fire squads simultaneously. Moving silently through familiar terrain, they flanked the teams just as torches were lit. The battle that followed was fierce, close, and desperate. Fighters lunging from behind trees, tackling Germans before they could throw torches, shooting fuel canisters mid-air to ignite harmlessly away from the forest. Within minutes, the attack collapsed, the SS squad scattered or dead. But the partisans were relentless. They hunted down the remaining fire teams across several kilometers, using knowledge of terrain to anticipate their movement. By nightfall, the threat was neutralized. The forest had been saved not by chance, but by extraordinary precision and unwavering resolve. As Soviet forces closed in further, the partisans' final operations took on a new nature. No longer solely focused on ambushes or sabotage, they began serving as guides, scouts, and local intelligence for the Red Army. They pointed out minefields, identified abandoned German fortifications, and directed Soviet units toward safe forest passages. They assisted in liberating villages, rescuing stragglers, and rounding up collaborators attempting to flee as disguised civilians. What had once been a hidden community became a vital component of the liberation effort sweeping across the region. And everywhere the Soviet troops marched, they encountered stories, whispers, rumors of a forest settlement that had somehow survived everything the Germans threw at them. Soldiers heard tales of sabotage missions, daring rescues, brutal winter endurance, and the impossible fact that over 1,000 Jews had lived and fought in the forest despite every attempt by the Nazis to exterminate them. Some Soviet commanders, hardened veterans of brutal campaigns, expressed disbelief until they witnessed the forest settlement with their own eyes. Shelters dug into the earth, workshops scattered among fallen trees, caches hidden under roots, patrol routes etched into memory and terrain, fighters armed with mismatched rifles, pistols, and captured German machine guns. But as liberation approached, a heavy truth settled over the camp. The forest had served its purpose, and soon it would no longer be home. The land that had protected them, fed them, hidden them, and absorbed their battles was now transitioning from frontline territory to liberated zone. The structures built for concealment now stood exposed to open air. The very qualities that once made the forest a sanctuary, its secrecy, its remoteness, its labyrinthine paths, were no longer needed. The camp had to dismantle itself. Shelters were collapsed or burned to prevent disease. Caches were emptied. Workshop pits were filled. Graves were tended. Paths were cleared one last time. For the first time in years, there was no next battle to prepare for, no German patrol expected, no winter trap looming. The forest, once alive with quiet tension, grew eerily calm. When the announcement finally came that the Red Army had secured the region and that the partisans were to march out and join liberated Belarus, the camp gathered in its central clearing. Fighters stood beside families, elders leaned on walking sticks, children clung to arms, remembering no world outside the trees. In silence, they prepared for the last march. Patrol routes that once guarded survival now served as pathways of departure. One by one, groups stepped onto the forest's main trail, carrying bundles, rifles, memories, and the weight of years lived in the shadow of death. The march was not triumphant. It was solemn, reflective, almost surreal. For so long, the forest had been the only world they knew. Every ridge held memories of ambushes. Every stream had carried whispers of warnings. Every glade had sheltered the vulnerable. As they moved through the forest for what they knew would be the last time, they passed the remains of shelters, the outlines of trenches fought in snow, mud, and fire. Some paused to place hands on trees that had shielded them from bullets. Others looked up at the canopy that had hidden them from aircraft. The forest was not merely a place, it had been a savior. When they emerged into open land, the sun fell differently, brighter, unobstructed, and the partisans felt exposed. But they did not walk alone. Soviet soldiers lined the road, watching these survivors, armed, alert, wearing patched clothing, and carrying the scars of a war fought in shadows. Some Soviet officers saluted them. Others stared in silence, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not refugees, not defeated civilians, but a community of fighters who had saved themselves. In the months that followed, the forest partisans were absorbed into civilian life, Soviet units, or resettlement groups. Some joined Red Army formations, continuing the push west. Others rebuilt towns. Many never saw the forest again. But the legacy of what they accomplished did not fade. They saved over 1,200 Jewish lives, not by hiding in silence, but by fighting, resisting, building, starving, surviving, and defying every expectation placed upon them. The forest that had sheltered them eventually healed. Trees grew over trenches.
Underbrush reclaimed paths. Shelters collapsed into the earth. The sounds of war faded into memory. But the forest would always hold the truth, that within its shadows a community had lived when the world expected them to die, that more than 1,000 people had chosen defiance over despair, that in the darkest chapter of modern history, the Naliboki Forest had been a beacon of courage, ingenuity, and impossible survival. The forest did not save them. They saved each other inside the forest. And that is how the Bielski Partisans carved their place into history, not as shadows fleeing death, but as a force that refused to be erased.